Hi, I'm John Atack, and yet again welcome my delightful friend Karen De La Carriere.
Hi, John, come here. Let me give you a warm hug.
A warm hug indeed.
Hi, John. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, and I'm now saying this at the beginning of videos, which is that we're here to teach people. We have a great deal of experience of the material we're talking about, decades and decades of it. But we're also here to learn, and we're here to answer questions if anybody has questions. And we're interested to be corrected if we make a mistake, whether trivial or otherwise. And we're part of a community of understanding and trying to understand the world better and the things in it. So please contribute and join in.
And I just want to add, we welcome opposing views. We don't stifle communication. This is not a site where if you oppose, good debate, opposing viewpoints encourage an expansion so that it doesn't look like a one-way propaganda like the Scientology TV channel. We're good, we're good, we're good. Look at us, look at us, look at us.
We know everything.
Yeah.
We'll sell it to you. Yeah, really. Great. Well, you wanted to say something about...
There's breaking news I did want the audience to know. Scientology did a kind of a creepy theft. They took some of Leah and Mike Rinder's podcasts and made videos stealing and thieving their content. So the video, when you clicked on it, looked like you were going to watch them, but very quickly it became a Scientology promotional video. So they actually stole Leah and her popularity to open their videos and then did the bait and switch, classic bait and switch. And the breaking news is, brace for impact. I am happy. The entire channel was nuked by YouTube. Not one or two videos. The channel is gone. And Leah joyously tweeted this. Spike will put there. The channel got nuked. It's a big disgrace to have YouTube delete your entire channel. That is not good. So I wanted to tell you one quick little story. About 5 or 7 years ago, the cult of Scientology decided to nuke my channel. And they sent 10 videos they wanted taken down. And I had a little bleep of footage of David Miscavige in his intimates. And they said, it's copyright, trademark. They could use Leah's, but this, they were going to take me out. And you know, the fair use law, when you're doing a whole education and you have a 1-minute clip to make your point, that is completely illegal. That is not. So I received an email from YouTube and it said, you know, they say you're violating copyright, trademark, and so on. And I wrote back and said, absolutely not. This is fair use, blah, blah, blah. And they sent that back to the cult. And the cult said, no, this is illegal, da, 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 da. Now, YouTube simply hosts the videos. They're simply a host. They're not going to get into combative senses. So YouTube wrote to me and said, they say that they will sue. Are you willing to receive a lawsuit? They will sue for copyright infringement. And, da, da, da. And I went to a lawyer, and a lawyer wrote a beautiful letter and said, sue me, go ahead, bring it on.
Yeah.
So then YouTube sent that back to the cult. It said, she says sue her. And I gave the full address where they should serve I've got multiple lawyers that firewall me, you know, and I think I gave Ray Jeffrey in Texas, he represented Debbie Cook. I gave the sue, bring it on. And then YouTube wrote me back and said, well, we sent your offer to be sued, and they've got 10 days to do it. We give a timeline.
Yeah.
If there's no lawsuit in the meantime, they had taken down these 10 videos, suspended them, pending the outcome. So they said, if in 10 days there's no lawsuit, all your videos go back up and your strikes will be removed. So 10 days went by and nothing happened. My videos didn't go up. And I was, what on earth? They don't count Saturday and Sunday in the 10 days. So the 10 days, Saturday and Sunday, plus it landed on a Saturday and Sunday. When they say 10 days, they mean Monday to Friday, right?
Working days.
And then suddenly I got an email from YouTube and said, we put your videos back up, all strikes are removed, you are in good standing. And that was the end of it. That's the last time Scientology tried to meddle. But they went for it. And I did a video, and it was, you know, David and Goliath. I knew how much money they had. I was ready to battle. I was ready for a lawsuit on this, which they could never, they knew that I would use the fair use doctrine. They knew they didn't have a hope in hell of winning that, you know.
Well, they have a tremendous amount of experience in copyright suits. I've been on the receiving end of a few. I was the expert witness in Russell Miller's case, where they tried to stop his book here. They sued him in the US and they sued him in Australia. But probably the strangest part of this for me was among the first litigation that I worked on was when Robin Scott was convicted in Denmark. And there was this weird new idea, really, because Scott had been the lookout for Ron Lawley and Morag Balmain when they lifted copies of the OT materials, the upper level materials, in Copenhagen in December 1983. And it was suddenly put to the court there in Denmark that this was industrial espionage. Probably the first time that esoteric, supposedly religious teachings have been considered to be business. Industrial. Yeah, it's about business, and it was a strange period for me. I got the material together that got Robin Scott released. Ultimately, though he was convicted, they sent him home and said, don't come back to Denmark for 5 years or something. But this idea that religious teachings were business, and this to me was a serious conflict, and I still haven't resolved it. But again, as I said before we started, Ron Hubbard, I used to keep a picture of Ron Hubbard on my wall that was cut from one of their magazines, and it got him, you know, doing that thing. And underneath it said, the criminal accuses others of things he himself is doing. I used to have it on the wall just to remind me that whenever Ron Hubbard accused somebody of something, he'd done it himself. So in this case, they're doing exactly that again, aren't they? Stealing material from other people.
Same old. Yeah. Did Russell Miller win those lawsuits?
Yes, we won all three of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because you can buy Russell Miller's book.
You can indeed, and it's been republished. And it's a
work you did to support that book.
I was involved from the very first. He was commissioned by the Sunday Times in London to do a story about where Ron Hubbard was hiding, and that was at the beginning of January 1986. And Hubbard, of course, decided he would die, so we couldn't go and find him in Creston. And the Sunday Times decided to go ahead with the pieces. I was commissioned as a researcher, and I gave Russell, because I'd been to so many publishers, and 11 publishers said they'd like to publish Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, but how are they going to make any money on it? Because they'd be sued. They knew all about the past books, like the Mindbenders by Vosper, but I think particularly the Mindbenders by Vosper, which had cost so much in litigation, even though it sold 108,000 copies around the world. And so publishers were saying, we'd love to publish this book. In fact, Collins, who are the largest publisher in the world and would subsequently merge with Harper and Row to become HarperCollins, they hung on for months saying they wanted to publish the book, and then eventually that my champion there was defeated. And so I couldn't get into print. So as part of the deal I made with Russell, so that the material would be known, I gave him my manuscript. And curiously, that manuscript came back to me a couple of years ago, because Russell gave it to Chris Owen and Chris Owen gave it to me. And I've got a copy of my printout with Russell's notes on it saying which bits of it he was going to use, which included 4 chapter titles and various other things. I was also the researcher throughout the 18-month project, though half of the book is Russell and his wife Renata's research, which was fantastic. He's a brilliant writer. It's a great book. It's the only real biography of Hubbard. And well worth reading. And what a great title, Barefaced Messiah.
Barefaced Messiah.
So we come again to the biography of Ron Hubbard in our topic today, in that we're going to talk about the famous Affirmations. And we put the background in for those that they're written 1946, 1947, probably. He's come out of the Navy. He's not crippled and blinded. That's not actually true. But he is trying to claim a disability pension from the Veterans Administration. And you can get both his Navy records and his Veterans Administration records through Freedom of Information. And I did. The week that he died, I put in for them as soon as I could get a death certificate. And if you're willing to go through about 1,200 pages of those 2 files, and I did more than once, then you find this man who in 1947 is desperate to have psychiatric treatment. He writes to the Veterans Administration and saying that he has a mind that is severely damaged. In fact, I have the letter right here. It's printed in full in this little book. Just to give something of the state of mind of this man who had discovered the world-saving technique that had cured all of his war wounds, this is a letter of the 15th of October, 1947. After trying and failing for 2 years to regain my equilibrium in civil life, I am utterly unable to approach anything like my own competence. My last physician informed me that it might be very helpful if I were to be examined and perhaps treated psychiatrically, or even by a psychoanalyst. Toward the end of my service, I avoided out of pride any mental examinations, hoping that time would balance a mind which I had every reason to suppose was seriously affected. I cannot account for nor rise above long periods of moroseness and suicidal inclinations, and have newly come to realize that I must first triumph above this before I can hope to rehabilitate myself at all. Would you please help me? Sincerely, L. Ron Hubbard. So that was his actual condition in 1947, at the time when he's writing the Affirmations. Affirmations are a method of self-hypnosis. And so you repeat these things to them. Napoleon Hill was a famous exponent of these in the 1930s. And the one I remember is you look in the mirror and you say, I get a little lovelier every day. It hasn't worked for me, I must say, but never mind. And he had, these affirmations are pretty scary.
Yeah, they are. We really want to get into them. But first of all, on this letter to the VA, Veterans Administration, based on what he was never a prisoner of war.
No.
What horror, torment, or torture did he experience?
Well, they'd asked him to go and fight in the war, and that had upset him, obviously, deeply. And which is why he spent the last year of the war pretending to have ulcers. In fact, there is no evidence that he had ulcers. They did x-rays and didn't find any. But he spent the last year of the war high on phenobarbital, and whinging about, his eyesight diminishing. He couldn't get into the Navy when he first applied before the Second War because his eyesight was too poor. And so he had, he gave an interview in November, December 1950 to Look magazine, in which he said that he had ulcers, conjunctivitis, pink eye. He'd damaged his hip when falling down a ship's ladder, and he had something wrong with his feet. And those were the war wounds. In 1950, that was the whole list. Of course, by 1965, in my philosophy, he's crippled and blinded, and in a very miserable state, really. There are different stories that he tells over the years that contradict one another about what had happened. So no, I think he was just scared of having to face the enemy, which he never did. Of course, he never saw combat.
Got it. Now, affirmations are simply sentences which are decisions or postulates for the future, meaning that sentence by self-hypnosis is affirming that this will become reality. That's the definition, right? Affirmation.
Yeah, it's
John.
Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, which Donald Trump grew up with.
But this isn't just thinking a flash thought. This is repeating these in a self-hypnosis, implanting self with this. Now, what is disturbing is how evil some of these affirmations were.
Men are your slaves. Yeah.
All men shall be my slaves. Now that actually worked out. The Sea Org are indentured slaves.
That was always his intention. Yeah, that was always his intention to dominate other people, and it's very clear through his history. There's a 1938 letter, which we call the Skipper letter because it starts "Dear Skipper," written in August 1938, which again is in my little book there, or a part of it is. And he says in it, writing to his first wife, Polly, who he called Skipper, Margaret Louise Grubb, it's her born name. And he writes to her and says that his only goal is to smash his name into history.
Yeah.
That's all he wants. He wants to be famous. And you go, that's really how ridiculous to want. He doesn't want to do good for anybody or help anybody. And throughout his life, he was, I think he was a very insecure human being who wanted power over other people. And that was significant to him. That was a driving force. And exactly as you say, with the Sea Organization from 1967 onwards, he actually did create a slave workforce. And people who were enslaved to him because they believed in him, because they believed in the positive things he said, and that they felt, that they were willing to, as you did, to give up the comforts of life to forward this incredible purpose, which was to save humanity, to save this sector of the galaxy, to save the universe, whatever. A star-high goal, as he put it. And that was not really what he was doing. What he was really doing was elevating L. Ron Hubbard to the state of, as his son Nibs said, he was making gods. So he was a god maker. He was the step up above gods. And no matter how godlike any of us became, none of us would be able to discover any technology that helped others spiritually. The only person who had that capacity was him, which eventually led to his claims of being God, which are buried here and there.
How well put that is. That's really the God maker who
Yeah.
had the power to make other gods.
Or make others believe that they were gods, as the case really was. I've yet to see any psychic feat performed by a Scientologist, and I've now had 47 years, and I'm waiting, you know, but it's not happened yet. And yet they believe they can.
Right.
They believe they can. They believe they change traffic lights and move clouds and stuff like that.
Well, you're supposed to achieve all that by doing 6 levels of exorcising attached spirits. People do it year in and year out, multiple times a day, with the hope of achieving godhood or a godlike thing.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, after 20 years of this, 30 years of auditing their attached spirits, they die off of cancer, heart attacks, diabetes, just like any other person that never addressed an attached spirit.
And often earlier in life than other people, because they don't get medical treatment rapidly enough.
Yeah, yeah. Now, John, I think what is most disturbing in the Affirmations is what Hubbard said about women and what he wanted to do with women.
Yes.
Can you read out the exact affirmation? There's 2 or 3 of them. I mean, they're pretty heavy. Like to write this, to hypnotize yourself, to want this to be reality. Can you read out the?
My mind is still brilliant. That masturbation was no sin or crime.
Yet Scientology could make masturbation a crime.
Yep.
It wasn't a crime for Hubbard.
Well, it wasn't a crime for him, yeah. These words and commands are like fire and will sear themselves into every corner of my being, making me happy and well and confident forever. Well, that didn't work. You can tell all the romantic tales you wish, but you know which ones were lies. You have enough real experience to make anecdotes forever. Stick to your true adventures. Masturbation does not injure or make insane. Your parents were in error. Yeah, they were about that. On and on and on. Yeah, material things are yours for the asking. Men are your slaves. You will live to be 200 years old. Well, you will always look young. It does say after that money will flood in upon you, and that did prove to be true. There's so much of this stuff, isn't there? There's also a little reference here to automatic writing, which it's a sidetrack, but you can do automatic writing whenever you wish. I talked with Jo Scott, who was Hubbard's secretary in 1954 in London, and she said to me, this was 30 years later, she said to me, he turned around to her one day and said Dianetics was done by automatic writing, and it was dictated to him by the Empress. And I was able to explain that to her, that, you know, that he had this holy guardian angel he called the Empress, and that I think it's in Evolution of a Science, he talks about using automatic writing as a method of research. So crikey. Oh, and you do not masturbate. Apparently there's nothing wrong with it, but he doesn't do it. Snakes are not dangerous to you.
But he just wanted the couple where he said that he could just use women for sex, even though there was some pretty violent also.
Testosterone blends easily with your own hormones. You have no fear of what any woman may think of your bed conduct. You know you are a master. You know they will be thrilled. You can come many times without weariness. Many women are not capable of pleasure in sex, and anything adverse they say or do has no effect whatever upon your pleasure. What a horrible man. You have no fear if they conceive. What if they do? You do not care. Pour it into them and let fate decide.
That's pretty brutal.
It is. Of course, when he announced the discovery of Dianetics to his agent, Forey Ackerman, in that first letter from Savannah, Georgia in 1949, he doesn't talk about any benefits. He says it'll make more money than anything else he's ever done, and that he can rape women without them knowing.
Yes.
He was a little bit misogynistic, I think we could say. So
it's not so much that he just wrote something like that. It's that he wanted to self-hypnotize himself with such thoughts. Anyone can have a spontaneous negative thought, but then on purpose, deliberately, to want that implanted or ingrained in your brain or mind or whatever, that's a different level. And Steve Hall worked at Goldbase Infase for 22 years, and he actually read this for the first time at Infase, where in marketing, when you do a CSW, completed staff work, you have to attach every attachment that supports such a thing. And the affirmations were there, and he read it on Infase, where it was attached to a document traveling up the command chain. So Sea Org hierarchy are very aware of this.
How interesting.
Yes.
Oh.
And I sent you, he did a debrief to Tony Ortega where he explained how this happened and how he read it at Infase. And I also sent you that link in the bullets I sent you. So to just click on the Tony Ortega, you can read the story. And here's Steve, signed for 1 billion years. And imagine reading this as a Sea Org member when you've pledged to join this group for 1 billion years. You know, John, the very Sea Org 1 billion year contract, I'd like to show pictures of it, Spike will help, actually says, the words are a little bit coded, but it says, you will do whatever the Sea Org demand of you. On demand, you will obey. It doesn't say obey.
Follow and uphold command intention. It's the code of a Sea Org member. That you will give up your self-determinism for the next 1,000 million years and be Hubbard's slave. Follow and uphold command intention.
And every week people join, but then there's the other side of the coin, where every week I heard from a well-informed source that there's no less than 100 Sea Org members waiting in line for their leaving sec check in every Sea Org base. There's 100 waiting in line because you can't leave, and there's a bottleneck because there are not enough people who can do these interrogatories. So yes, they're bringing them in, but there's also a revolving door where people sign 1 billion years and last 1 year, 2 years, 5 years.
2 weeks sometimes. Is there somewhere in particular, this is quite a long article on the bunker. Is there something in particular you wanted to extract from it?
Well, there were 2 documents that Steve Hall was aghast at. One was the Affirmations, and the other was Hubbard stating that he was the Antichrist and Jesus was a lover of young boys.
Which was originally the opening statement of the OT VIII material, the highest.
It was. And I could not believe it. When I read that. When I read that, I went, John, I said, he's got a lot of enemies. This is propaganda. I could not.
Well, Steve Fishman first released this material, and Fishman is something of a confidence trickster. So when I first saw that, I just went, this can't possibly be true. Then this guy, George White, released it, having done the course. And in 2015 at Toronto, at the Getting Clear conference, Jesse Prince, who of course was the head of Scientology technology at the time, confirmed to us that this had indeed been the opening statement. But after about a week, they had to take it off because people were, they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to carry on. And so the statement we have here is, unlike just about everyone else, I never got bent out of shape over the statement that Jesus was, this is Hubbard speaking, that Jesus was a lover of young boys and men because of the neglected passage in the oldest and least embellished of the Gospels, Mark 14:51. That's not actually true. The oldest and least embellished, John is probably the oldest, but let's not get into nitpicking here. Jesus has left his disciples in the lower part of Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, and they fell asleep. Soon afterwards, Judas came with the crowd to take Jesus away, and a young man followed him, which is to say Jesus, with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Scholars do not know who this boy was. The passage exists only in Mark and nothing else in the New Testament or even the Hebrew Bible, as I understand the scholarship, provides any basis for comparison. I do believe, too, that a subculture of young male, pre-body hair prostitution existed in the Greco-Roman world. Several decades ago, the biblical scholar Morton Smith claimed that while separating sheets of paper covering ancient books in a Middle Eastern monastery, he found a letter from a church father claiming that Jesus likely was initiating the youth into esoteric Christianity, a claim in line with Gnosticism. Years afterwards, another scholar alleged fraud on Smith's part. In any case, no one knows what the passage means. And I've got no idea where he's going with this. Having read the Gospel of Mark several times, I don't know what Hubbard is seeing that I and many other people completely fail to see. Where are we? Do you want to go to the next one? I will soon leave.
No, I want to just pause and examine that.
Yeah. So a lover of young boys and men is the allegation that Ron Hubbard is making against Jesus.
This could be very offensive to Christians watching your show. And again, we are just quoting Hubbard.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not our belief.
That I believe, you believe, whatever. I do believe there was a man called Jesus, even though Hubbard later said there was no Christ. It was all
man on the cross is a fabrication, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is this, that first, there were 184 students that did the very first OT VIII, 184 pages.
That was in 1988?
I thought it was 87, somewhere there, right around 87. Now, it costs about $1 million to get there, literally. And I'm counting all the snagging you for donations at your bridge and years of auditing your attached spirits. You see, you don't automatically get the next OT level. You've got to get RTC and OSA clearance. And you've got to keep up your payments to the International Association of Scientologists. If you're not contributing to them, the ethics officer says, what are your contributions? What have you done? So it's by invitation only. 184 people made the grade. The religion has been around since 1950. So 1987, how many years is that?
37 years.
In 37 years, they cobbled together 184 students. And it was catastrophe, John. Some people with a stiff British upper lip, stoic, sat through it, silent, zip that didn't want to be. If you're negative and somebody knowledge reports you, that's another $50,000 for interrogatory set checks. So people were stoic and then they left.
Of course, what else is said in that? Hubbard claims to be Lucifer. He claims to be the Antichrist.
Yep, all in the same document.
Yeah.
Much of those 184 left, never to be seen of again, like the George Whites of the world. I had a particular friend called Christine, who had literally a mental breakdown. She came back from this OT VIII and she spun and went what the church called type 3. She literally had a full-blown mental breakdown. She recovered and went into Buddhism, never to, but they saw that this was, they saw this. Now, in this issue I sent you where Steve Hall debriefed to Tony Ortega, Miscavige visited with him and Dan, the so-called biographer that never writes a biography ever,
Yeah.
The church can't issue a biography. After books like yours, John, and Madman or Messiah, Barefaced Messiah, they cannot. There's just too many disclosures. They can. The affirmations alone, which Wikipedia have every single clause, people can just go to Google and put in L. Ron Hubbard affirmations Wikipedia, and you can read all this for yourself. Anyway, Miscavige walked up to Dan and Steve, and with his piercing blue eyes, Miscavige asked Steve, watching him intently, "What do you think of this?" And Steve knew he was on a precipice. If you answer Miscavige wrong, you can be walked straight to SB Hole or the dungeon or whatever. I mean, Miscavige's total power over your life.
He is the slave master of the organization.
Absolutely. So he was thinking 100 miles an hour. How do I answer this? And he thought, I'm going to play it safe for my own survival. And he said, well, I think it's cool. He thought to be neutral would be safe ground. And Miscavige was delighted to hear that. But Steve tells the story breakdown by breakdown to Tony Ortega and but after that, Steve plotted how he could get out of base. Once the con becomes so obvious when you've truly experienced something like this. Now, David Miscavige, all by himself, he doesn't take orders, he doesn't listen, he doesn't have Scientology brag about having a qualifications division, which is supposed to internally correct you. But there's no internal correction whatsoever. There's no watchdog over Miscavige. His word is biblical law in the cult, the way he's followed. And Steve knew that if he threatened to kill himself, they would offload him as type 3. And that's the ploy he used. He said he was suicidal. He was nowhere near suicidal. But to get out of base without 2 years of psych checks, because if you're already type 3, what they consider lunatic, wanting to kill yourself, they're not going to keep you there to give you more interrogatories in case you... So that's how it got exposed. But back to what now, you're the scholar, you are the Scientology scholar. What benefit would Hubbard possibly get by saying he's Lucifer? Now remember that David Miscavige single-handedly decided to put this on the opening page of OT VIII. He decided it. He did that. He got this catastrophe result. People fled and then they tweet. There's 5 different versions of OT VIII, which is absurd. A level is a level. There's not different editions and versions of it. was Hubbard, tell me about, as a scholar, looking back on it, did Hubbard really believe he was the Antichrist?
Yes.
Because,
Yes.
he believed that.
Yes.
So was he already somewhat, was he getting into, see, Dr. Denk predicted years before this, he told Bill Franks confidentially that Hubbard had the onset of dementia, Alzheimer's.
Yes.
So is this a man in some kind of dementia prophet? See, this is why I don't believe it. He wrote 10 books called Mission Earth, incredibly coherent. That's a thriller. I read them.
Yeah, well, they're incredibly coherent because of the editor, not because of Hubbard. I interviewed Robert Vaughn Young, who edited those books, and he said it was a nightmare bringing any coherence to them. The thing I particularly remember is him telling me that there were characters in the book that he had to exclude. One of them was a Native American, as Hubbard put it, a First Nations squaw, who he called Tight Pussy. And Vaughan was able to write that character out, but it was because Vaughan was a really good writer that he was able to knock this. Hubbard only drafted things the first time. You get it once and that was it. He didn't have the patience to look at his own work and remake it, which is why there is only one Scientology book that Hubbard wrote, and that's Dianetics. All of the other books are compilations, one way or another, made by other people, Richard DeMille, Althea Hart, or John Sanborn. Because Hubbard didn't have, he just said his attention deficit disorder, his hyperactivity was such that he was bored as soon as he had to look at his own things. But the Lucifer story is foundational to Scientology. This didn't just spring out of the demented mind of L. Ron Hubbard, in the early 1980s, as he was on his way to death. This is something that is there long before the beginning. When Hubbard was 16 years old, he read Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law. So we're talking about somewhere around 1927. And he reads the Book of the Law, which, to get an understanding of Scientology, one of the complaints that was made about me by Scientology was that I had a lot of magic books. And it's true, I do. Because I had to understand Hubbard, who had read these books. And in going through Aleister Crowley's work, and I found it very difficult to read Crowley, I find him a very objectionable human being. Let me put it that way.
He was a cocaine freak, wasn't he?
He was a cocaine freak. He was a heroin addict by the time.
Heroin addict.
But yes, he will have used a broad range of drugs, and he boasted about that. There is an ethos in the work of Crowley. Crowley is a confidence trickster who becomes involved with Golden Dawn, where the poet W.B. Yeats is a member. And these are people who are practitioners of ritual magic. They believe that by performing magical ceremonies, they can gain power over deities and over spirits. And remembering the Affirmations, Hubbard also says, elemental beings are my slaves, which is to say body thetans. And here's a first principle of magic. In Disney World, the idea is that magic is performed by spells. These are incantations, you make statements and these things will happen. It is made through talismans. So in Voodoo or Voodoo, you have the mojo, the little bag with the bones and the coin and things in it, which will give you power. You have the black cat bone. These are talismans. These are things that are meant to be instruments of power. But the reality of ritual magic is rather different. The reality, if one reads the book of Abramelin the Mage, for example, which I've had the misfortune of doing, we find that magic is performed by elemental spirits. So what you do is you take over genies or discarnate entities, body thetans, gedons, dibuks. There are many words for these beings throughout the world. You take power over these beings and you then use them to travel and do your will. And so Hubbard was educated into these practices from the age of 16 onwards, and he believed in them. And if we then look at Crowley's teaching, Crowley is saying that Christianity is wrong because it confines people with conscience. And what Crowley wanted was to be above that. He wanted magical power. So one of the things that he did as a young man was he would keep a razor blade in his pocket. And anytime he violated his own will, he would cut himself, kind of aversion therapy. And the idea was basically to be able to do things that were offensive to other people. That the way you came to control your own will and become powerful was to be a devil, was to be an objectionable and awful person. And that meant that you had to break taboos. You had to do things that were considered immoral by society. Crowley frequently complains about the moralizing hypocrisy of Christianity, and I can understand that criticism if and when there is hypocrisy. But he felt that to obtain power, it was necessary to do immoral things. And this became pretty extreme with Crowley. Some of the more difficult to obtain Crowley teachings, I managed to get my hands on them. There is one particularly despicable, for me, particularly despicable aspect, where he talks about the excitement he has at taking leukorrhea, which is the fluid that is created when you have gonorrhea. And this would be part of his sexual practice, to be dominated by a woman who had gonorrhea and to take this stuff. So you're dealing with somebody who's got some pretty weird things going on. There were many suicides around the Crowley OTO. There were many criticisms of him. He was on Adolf Hitler's hit list because so many of Hitler's cronies had been members of the Tool Society, which was a sister group to the OTO, which was a German organization that Crowley came to take over. Crowley's objective was to be the Antichrist. It was to overtake Christianity. So when in 1946 you have this pivotal moment where Hubbard, far from being crippled and blinded, is actually down in Pasadena in 1946 and has wormed his way into the household of Jack Parsons, John Whiteside Parsons. Parsons is a remarkable man. He was the developer of solid rocket fuel. There wouldn't have been any NASA missions without solid rocket fuel. So somebody else would probably have worked it out, but he's the man who did work it out. And he was totally devoted to Aleister Crowley's teachings. So in his household, magical practices, what is called sex magic, and magic is spelt with a K here for some reason, were going on. And there is a correspondence between Aleister Crowley and Carl Germer, who was the head of the OTO in California, and to whom Parsons answered, where Crowley is criticizing the ceremony that Hubbard and Parsons performed. This is called the Babylon working. You can get the whole ceremony. It was all transcribed. And basically what happened was, while Jack Parsons masturbated, Aaron Hubbard watched and called out this incantation. It took me a long while to work out, but I did work out that this was actually the 8th working of the OTO. OTO VIII. And what they were trying to do was to bring a woman to them who would be the mother of the whore of Babylon, the scarlet woman of the Revelation of St. John the Divine, which is the last book of the Christian New Testament. And this would bring the beast 666 into the world and overthrow Christianity and bring the reign of Satan on earth. So this was Hubbard's objective in 1946. Out of which comes Scientology. And I would say that Scientology is a furtherance of this idea. It's to enslave a large number of people, to bring a lot of money and power to him. But what he was he had various things that he was trying to do. One of them was to create his own country. And so, he tried to, I think it was part of Mozambique he tried to buy, and they refused to sell it to him. But putting the seal out there to have his own little nation, his own group of people, who would then, with none of them knowing what they were actually doing, it's all two-faced. It was all exactly the opposite of what he was saying. He was creating his own paramilitary force. I mean, initially it was said that the Sea Org would have to train in judo. They would have weapons training. They, of course, get put into Coast Guard uniforms, Navy uniforms. And he's creating this force. And out of this, he's creating Scientology. And for me, and not many people have come to this conclusion, but I am very certain of it. Just as the Babylon ceremony is called a working, it is an attempt to bring down the force of the devil, the force of Lucifer to earth, and use that force for Hubbard's means. In the same way, Scientology is a magical working. It is a way of disabling people so that they become enslaved and will worship Hubbard. That worship is seen at two places on the bridge. The first is the old power processors, where people are meant to have the revelation that Hubbard is the source. He is the origin. That was then replaced. It was pushed aside. It's very rare for the power processors to be delivered. Certainly after, 1982, somewhere around there, you just don't hear of them anymore. People are jumping to clear without doing what was grade 5, and grade 5A, the power processors. So they're not doing that. They're now going to do that at OT VIII. At OT VIII, they're going to be taught that Ron Hubbard is the source, that he is Lucifer, that he is the creator God out of whom the universe came. And this should lead then to the next phase in Scientology, which will come after Miscavige, if it comes at all, where some sect will spring up and say, he was, just as Jesus was, he was a divine force on earth. And we're certainly, the way that Hubbard is treated by many Scientologists as this infallible, brilliant, divine man, we're certainly seeing some of that. In Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, it was very interesting when Marty Rathbun, in a blog posted somewhere around 2014, 2015, he said he'd realized that Hubbard wished to become a god. And I wrote to Marty at that time, he didn't reply, and said, read the summing up in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, published in 1990 and not altered at all since then, where I explain that Hubbard is trying to become a god. He seems to be following a model that was found in ancient Rome and in China, where by people invoking your name, I want to smash my name into history, 1938, by people invoking your name, you will be a deity. There's a touching moment in the wonderful TV drama that was made from Robert Graves' I, Claudius and Claudius the God, where Livia, who is the last wife of the Emperor Augustus, realizing that Claudius will become emperor, says, "Make me a god, because then I will live forever." And I think Hubbard is caught up in that, this bizarre idea that somehow by his name being repeated, he will continue to exist. And that's all caught up in his God fantasy. So it goes right back to the 1920s. We find it again in 1946. And of course, a woman did come along. A woman called Marjorie Cameron came along and became, after Hubbard had run off with Jack Parsons' girlfriend, Sarah Northrop, Sarah Hollister, she'd later be, Hubbard goes off, and Parsons actually has a relationship with Cameron, who's arrived in answer to their invocation. She doesn't have a child. Crowley calls them, Hubbard and Parsons, louts. There was a mistranscription, and usually the letter, when printed, says goats, but I'm pretty sure the original was louts. Yet he's criticizing them for trying to bring into being what he would call a moonchild. He wrote a novel called The Moonchild, which is the incarnation of a divinity through human form. So, yeah, all very complicated. I wrote a paper called Hubbard and the Occult, and there's a chapter in Blue Sky called His Magical Career, which details these events. But yeah, I think he believed it was Lucifer. And I think the part that the dementia plays, and I'm pretty sure looking at what happened, certainly in 1983 onwards, that there's something badly wrong with Hubbard's mind by this time. He's not keeping it together anymore. And so he decides he's going to make this boast. He decides that this secret that he's kept in, again, looking back at his oldest son, Nibs. Nibs worked with him from 1952 to 1959. He was his second in command, effectively. And he's been thoroughly discredited by Scientology to the extent that most people don't believe anything that Nibs said. Now, there is an incredible manuscript called The Telling of Me by Me. It's in the UCLA collection of Scientology material, and it should be published. I was allowed to see a copy of it with the understanding that I wouldn't share it, and I haven't. I've had it in my possession now for 7 or 8 years. And it is a revelation, because if you separate out what Nibs Hubbard says his father told him, which he believed that his father had the door to, he could open the gates of hell. He believed his father was a supremely evil human being. If you separate out what he says that is based upon what his father told him, that he got the magic from the same person that Hitler got it from, for example, that's just what Hubbard said. If you look at then what Nibs says he experienced with his father, I think most of what he says is true, and some of it is horrifying, particularly, and we come back now around this circuit to his treatment of women. That Nibs Hubbard gives a description. He says that what his father liked to do was to give contraindicated drugs to women. Now, we know from Hubbard's own writings he admitted to having been a barbiturate addict. He said he made himself a guinea pig in one of these experiments in a lecture, and coming off phenobarbital is particularly hard. So he admitted addiction to barbiturates. He advocated the use of amphetamines. So you have a downer, a barbiturate, and an upper. And if you mix the two together, and I don't recommend this to any of the children at home, then what you get is a kind of blank state. And in that state, it would appear Hubbard raped women. During the 1950s and early 60s, he had many groupies. John McMaster, the world's first real clear, told me that as he traveled around the world, he met many red-haired babies. Then I believe Hubbard became impotent somewhere in the mid-60s and was no longer sexually competent. Nibs gives a description saying that he and his father performed sadistic ceremonies, let's say rituals, upon women. And what they would do is he would give them a mixture, probably an amphetamine and a barbiturate together. So they would have no memory of what had happened to them. They would be put into a hypnotic state. They would strip them down, and then his father would cut them with a razor blade and beat them and whatever. And when I first saw this sort of material, I didn't believe it. I was in communication with Nibs in 1984 through an intermediary, and we had quite a lot of questions he answered, and he indeed put out a little tape at that time. But there was one particularly telling thing where he talks about being able to talk a woman into having an orgasm by giving them the right mixture of drugs. And he proved this. A friend of mine in 1985, because Nibs had come back alive and he was selling what he said was the true technology of Scientology. He did admit to being something of a rascal and not necessarily truthful all the time. So you have to be very careful. I had a friend, as I say, who traveled to see Nibs I think he was in Carson City in Nevada at the time. And she wrote me a letter, which I still have, where she said that she had just had sex with the Holy Ghost. And I didn't understand that until years later. I read this manuscript where he talks about how you can talk somebody into having a woman into having an orgasm. So there's this other layer that is to do with ritual magic, contempt for women, and enslaving people. So it's sort of vampirism. That's the way I see it, that Hubbard was a spiritual vampire who basically sucked the power out of people so he could use it for himself, and quite a lot of it put in his bank account as well. So there we go. That's a fairly long statement, isn't it? Would you like to respond to that, Karen?
I think what is so important in revelations like this is disinfecting the disinformation. The disinformation and propaganda of the church is just swallows poor newbie. We should do a video one day on 5 things the church won't tell you. Attention, new Scientologists, 5 things you will only discover later on. And boom, boom, bomb, bomb, bombshell, bombshell, just the 5 top ones. And it's addressed to newbies who now think that they have wandered into this Disneyland of spiritual fabulous highs and growth. And so, but
it's a very good idea. Yeah,
I'd like to do that. I think that you disinfect disinformation, John. You've got so many facts, so much knowledge. What I'd like to do in the next show with you is I've got all the different versions of OT VIII. I'd like to show you and discuss with you what exactly they run on OT VIII.
Yeah,
because
truth revealed.
And just give a little bit of teaser about it. Every single identity you ever come up with in all your Scientology history. If you wrote, I was in the Roman Empire and I was a gladiator and I was on a slave ship and I was getting whipped, blah, blah. So gladiator, Roman centurion, slave, every identity is culled out of your past history. And then they've taken away that Hubbard was the Antichrist. It opens with checking these identities. And you're asked, is it yours? Is it a BT's? Is this identity, was it an attached spirit? Or is it a gang of attached spirits called cluster? So you're back into the BT, even at OT VIII, you're doing it. And then right at the end, you are told everything you ever ran in Scientology was BT cluster track. None of that was yours. So all if you spent 100,000 on 3 L's, you didn't get the L. Some BT got the L in there. And this is an earthquake to people. That none of their auditing. So the EP of OT VIII, we're going to do a snazzy show on it, but the EP means the final end result.
Yep.
You are told, you now know who you were not, and now you can go find out who you are. $1 million. And now you emphatically know, because none of these past identities was yours. This spins some people. Some people go into a tailspin. Yeah. And I want to end off this show with giving you a teaser of what John and I are going to get into. We're really going to get into your $1 million blood, sweat, and tears to achieve godhood. But what you find out is you are told that all your auditing that you ever had was run on attached spirits, and you were none of those things. Now go away and find out who. That's the truth. That's supposedly the truth revealed. But let's do a really Stasi show on that.
Yeah,
John, you've taken this to a real peak, and you've revealed things that counter the disinformation propaganda. Good on you.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you a big hug, and I look forward to seeing you in a month's time.
Great.
We are on a ride.
Definitely. It's fun.
Let's increase our 90 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour.
Light speed.
Love you,
Thank you
John.
so much, Karen.
Take care, sweetheart.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.